until the poor maid's toddler pinched his nose and his eyes fluttered open. He was worth $4 billion. He owned 3 private jets, a mansion on every continent, and a name that made presidents pick up the phone on the first ring. But tonight, Edward Harrington lay completely still, cold, silent, not breathing. The hospital room was filled with the best doctors money could buy. 12 of them. 12 brilliant minds with degrees from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and Oxford. 12 white coats crowded around that bed, checking monitors, reading charts, shaking their heads. And then, one by one, they walked away. The lead doctor turned off the heart monitor. The soft green line went flat. He looked at the nurse and whispered 2 words that no one ever wants to hear. Time of death, 11:47 p.m. The room went quiet. The billionaire was dead. But nobody, absolutely nobody, had noticed the tiny little girl standing in the corner of that room. She was 3 years old. She wore a wrinkled pink dress with a small strawberry on the pocket. Her eyes were huge and dark and full of something that had no business being in a hospital room that night. She walked forward on small, bare feet. She climbed up onto the bed. She looked at the man's still face with curious, innocent eyes. And then she pinched his nose. Stay with me, because what happened next will change the way you see everything. Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to Truly Means to Be Human. Before we get into today's story, I have one simple question for you. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in the United States? Dropped an American flag kingdom? Let me know. United Kingdom, my Canadian friends. Are you with us tonight? Canada, Australia. Watching from down under? Australia, India. One of the most loving audiences in the world. Are you here? India and Germany. Welcome, friends. Germany. Wherever you are in this world, you are exactly where you are supposed to be right now. Because this story was meant for you tonight. Get comfortable. Maybe grab some tissues. Never miss a story like this. Now, let's go back to that hospital room. Let's go back to that little girl in the pink dress. Let's go back to the moment that nobody could explain. Edward James Harrington III had not always been cold. There was a time, a long, beautiful time, when he was just Eddie, a skinny boy from a small town in Ohio who used to catch fireflies in a mason jar and give them to his mother, so she would have light even when the electricity was cut off. And the electricity was cut off a lot, because Eddie's family was poor. Not just regular poor, the kind of poor where you learn how to make one meal stretch across 3 days. The kind of poor where Christmas morning means an orange and a pair of socks, and you still feel rich because your mama is smiling. Eddie's mother, Margaret, worked 3 jobs. She cleaned offices at night. She babysat other people's children during the day. On weekends, she ironed clothes for the neighbors, pressing each shirt so carefully you'd think she was preparing it for royalty. Her hands were always red and raw from the work, but she never complained. Not once. She used to tell young Eddie the same thing every night before bed. She'd sit on the edge of his thin mattress, brush the hair from his forehead, and say, "Baby, money comes and goes. But the way you treat people, that stays forever. In this life and the next." Eddie would nod. He would believe her. He would fall asleep dreaming of a day when he could give his mother everything she deserved. And he did. By the time Edward was 32 years old, he had built a technology empire that stretched across 6 continents. He invented a software system that changed how hospitals managed patient data, and for that, governments paid him billions. He had his name on buildings, his face on magazine covers. He had everything, except the thing his mother had tried to give him. Because somewhere between the first million and the first billion, Eddie disappeared. And Edward Harrington took his place. Edward didn't catch fireflies anymore. Edward fired employees by email, sometimes while they were still sitting in the same building. Edward walked past homeless people on the street without blinking. He hadn't visited his mother's grave in 6 years because he said he was too busy. And somehow he believed that. 3 ex-wives had each said the same thing in their divorce proceedings. He is brilliant. He is successful. and he makes you feel completely invisible. He lived in a 42-room mansion outside of Boston with a full-time staff of 19 people. Gardeners, chefs, a personal driver, 2 assistants, a cleaning team that rotated every other day. One of those cleaners was a woman named Rosa. Rosa Espinoza was 31 years old, originally from Guatemala, and had been working in Edward's household for 2 years. She was quiet. She was thorough. She kept her head down and did her job so well that most people barely noticed she existed, which, in Edward Harrington's world, was exactly how he liked it. Rosa had one daughter. Her name was Luna. Luna was 3 years old, with big black eyes and 2 pigtails and a laugh that sounded like someone had figured out how to bottle pure sunlight. She was small for her age, but enormous in spirit, curious about everything, afraid of nothing, absolutely convinced that every single person on earth was a friend she simply hadn't met yet. Rosa brought Luna to work only when her babysitter was unavailable. Edward had strict rules about children on the property. He had never once looked at Luna directly. To Edward Harrington, Luna Espinoza did not exist. But God or the universe or fate or whatever you believe in had a very different opinion about that. It was a Tuesday evening in October when the ambulance came. Rosa was in the west wing of the mansion, scrubbing the marble floors of the third guest bathroom, a bathroom no guest had used in over a year, when she heard the sound. A crash. Loud and sudden and terrible, like a piece of the world had simply broken off. She dropped her mop and ran. She found Edward Harrington on the floor of his private study, collapsed beside his enormous mahogany desk. He was 52 years old and had never been sick a day in his life, or so he always said. He had ignored the chest pains for 3 weeks because he was in the middle of a merger and didn't have time. He had ignored the shortness of breath because he thought he just needed more sleep. He had ignored his doctor's calls because his doctor never had anything important to say. Now he was on the floor, unconscious, the left side of his face pale as chalk, his expensive Italian suit twisted around him like the world had grabbed him and shaken him hard. Rosa called 911. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone twice. She stayed on the line. She stayed beside him. Luna wandered in from the hallway where Rosa had left her coloring with her crayons. The little girl looked at the man on the floor with wide, steady eyes. She walked over and crouched beside him, straight down, no hesitation, the way children do. "Mama," she said, looking up with total calm. "The man is sleeping on the floor." "I know, baby," Rosa said, her voice cracking. "Go back to your crayons, okay? The ambulance is coming." Luna looked at the man one more time. Then she went back to her crayons. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. Massive heart attack. His heart had stopped for nearly 90 seconds before they restarted it with the defibrillator. They rushed him to Boston General, the best cardiac facility in New England. Rosa rode in the ambulance. She didn't know why, exactly. She had no obligation to. He was her employer, not her family. He had never been kind to her. He had never once asked her name in 2 years. He called all the cleaning staff you or simply pointed. But Rosa was Rosa. And Rosa had been raised the same way Eddie had once been raised, to believe that every human being matters, no matter what. She held his cold hand in the ambulance and prayed in Spanish. Luna sat beside her, still holding a yellow crayon, watching the city lights blur past the small oval window. Wilson and Fletcher arrived within the hour. His personal assistant Daniel arrived with a briefcase full of emergency contacts. Edward's private doctor flew in from New York. Nobody asked who Rosa was. Nobody asked who the little girl was. They sat in the corner of the waiting room, the maid and her daughter, invisible, the way they always were. Luna fell asleep across 2 chairs with her head in Rosa's lap, still clutching her yellow crayon. Rosa didn't sleep at all. Around 2 in the morning, the doctor came out. She could see Fletcher grip the arm of his chair. She understood. It was not good. The next 36 hours were a war. Edward's heart had suffered catastrophic damage. The main artery, the one doctors grimly call the widowmaker, had been completely blocked. Critical minutes had passed before the paramedics reached him. His brain had been without sufficient oxygen. His body was fighting, but the monitors told a darker story every hour. His sons brought in specialists, not just good ones, the best money could reach. Cardiologists from the Mayo Clinic, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins, a cardiac recovery specialist who had once treated a sitting U.S. senator. They flew in on private planes and walked into that hospital like an army. Rosa and Luna were still there. Nobody had told them to leave, and Rosa didn't know where else to go. She had tried to send Luna home with her cousin, but Luna had cried so hard and clung to Rosa's coat so desperately that Rosa had given up. So there they stayed, eating vending machine crackers and apple juice, watching the parade of brilliant people march toward room 412. Luna had made a drawing. She used her yellow crayon and a piece of paper Rosa found at the nurse's station. She drew what she called the sleeping man, a big oval for the body, 2 lines for legs, a circle for the head, and 2 closed eyes. Then she drew something floating above his head. "What's that, baby?" Rosa asked. Luna looked at it seriously. "It's his happy," she said. "He lost it. I'm giving it back." Rosa stared at that drawing for a long time and didn't say a word. On the second day, the doctors held a meeting, all 12 of them. They reviewed every scan, every test, every number. They discussed brain activity, oxygen deprivation, cardiac function, recovery probability. Then they walked out of that conference room with the kind of silence that says everything without saying anything. The lead physician, a tall man with silver hair and Rosa was close enough to hear. "His heart is beating," the doctor said carefully, "but brain activity is minimal. What we're seeing is consistent with a persistent vegetative state." "I'm deeply sorry," his voice broke. "What does that mean?" "It means," the doctor said gently, "that we wait. And we prepare ourselves for the likelihood that your father is not." He walked away down the hallway, and Rosa heard him crying before he turned the corner. The doctors began to leave. One by one, they gathered their things. They wrote their notes. They gave condolences. They told the nurses what to do for comfort care. The heart monitor continued its slow, lonely rhythm. Edward Harrington was not technically dead, but the people with all the degrees and all the decades of experience had looked at every piece of data available and decided, quietly and respectfully, that he was not coming back. The last specialist left the floor at 9 in the morning. The room went quiet. Rosa sat in the chair by the window with Luna asleep in her lap, the little girl's warm weight a comfort she hadn't expected to need so badly. She looked at the man in the bed. She thought about how she had worked in his house for 2 full years, and he had never once looked at her. She thought about the 37 missed calls she'd seen on his phone from his sons, from people who loved him, all ignored because he had been busy building more. "He's very lonely," Rosa whispered to no one. "Even now, he's very lonely." Luna woke up at 9:17 in the morning. She woke up the way children do, completely and immediately, like a light switching on. 1 second asleep. Next second sitting up straight with bright eyes, looking around the room as if she'd been there her whole life. "Mama," she said, "can I go see the sleeping man?" Rosa was exhausted in a way she hadn't felt since the night her own father had passed away in Guatemala 8 years before. She almost said no. She almost said it was time to go home. But she looked at her daughter's face. And something in Luna's expression, that steady, certain look that children sometimes get, the look that makes you wonder what they know that you don't, made Rosa pause. "Okay," she said softly. For a minute, Rosa carried Luna down the hall to room 412. The door was slightly open. The nurse had just done and Fletcher were in the cafeteria. The room was empty except for the man in the bed and the steady, soft sound of the monitor. Rosa stood in the doorway. Luna looked at the man for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, very matter-of-factly, "Put me down, Mama." Rosa put her down. Luna walked to the bed. She was too small to see over the edge, so she found the little step stool the nurses used, dragged it over with both hands, and climbed up. She stood there and looked at Edward Harrington's face. Really looked the way only children look at things, without judgment or fear or the weight of knowing what was supposed to happen. His nose. Luna said quietly. What baby? Rosa asked from the doorway. Luna didn't answer. Instead, with two small fingers, her thumb and index finger, she leaned forward and pinched Edward Harrington's nose. Not hard, not cruelly. The way you pinch a nose to be playful. The way children do when they're trying to make someone laugh or wake up or pay attention. Luna. Rosa started, stepping forward. And then it happened. Edward Harrington's face twitched. Rosa froze. His lips pressed together. His brow furrowed just barely, the kind of movement you could miss if you blinked. And then, his eyes fluttered. Not a spasm. Not an involuntary muscle movement. His eyelids moved, the slow, effortful movement of someone trying very hard to open them. Like a man who had been underwater and was finally breaking through to the surface. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth. Luna kept looking at him, completely calm, as if she had expected exactly this. Hello, Luna said to the man whose eyes were still struggling open. I know you're in there. Mama says everybody is in there, even when it looks like they're not. Edward Harrington's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, two dark irises staring up at the white ceiling, not seeing anything, or maybe seeing everything. And then, slowly, as if learning how to use them all over again, his eyes moved. They found Luna's face. And something happened to Edward Harrington's expression that nobody in 40 years of knowing him had ever reported seeing before. He started to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a single tear that slid down the side of his pale face and disappeared into the white pillow. But his lips were moving, slowly, silently, and Rosa, who had crept closer without realizing it, could read exactly what they were saying. Two words, over and over. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The nurse found them 3 minutes later. She walked into room 412 for a routine check and stopped dead in the doorway when she saw the monitors. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the man in the bed. She looked at the small child standing on the step stool beside him. And she pressed the emergency call button so fast she nearly fell over. What followed was organized chaos. Doctors ran in. Nurses ran in. Someone paged the lead cardiologist who had already driven halfway to the airport to catch his flight home. He turned his car around. Rosa grabbed Luna and backed against the wall, holding her daughter tight, watching the room fill with people in white, doing the exact opposite of what they'd been doing 12 hours ago. Now they were not walking away quietly. Now they were moving fast, calling out numbers, asking questions, checking responses. Because Edward Harrington was responding. His grip strength was weak, but it was there. His eyes tracked movement. When the neurologist shone a light in his eyes, both pupils reacted normally. This is impossible, one of the younger residents whispered. An older nurse shot him a look that said, not in front of the family, to find the hallway packed with medical staff. Fletcher, first doctor, he recognized. What's happening? Is he? He's awake, the doctor said. And then he said it again because the first time didn't seem to. Wilson sat down on the floor, in the middle of the hallway. Just sat down, right there, like his legs had made a decision, without consulting him. Fletcher leaned against the wall and put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook. Rosa watched all of this from the corner. Luna had fallen back asleep against her shoulder, completely unbothered by all the commotion she had somehow caused. 3 days later, when Edward could finally speak clearly, his very first words, documented by the nurse on duty, were, "Was there a little girl?" The nurse told him yes. A little girl named Luna, the cleaning woman's daughter. Edward found Rosa in the waiting room, where she was finally preparing to go home after 3 days. She had assumed the crisis was over. She had assumed that now that Edward was awake, Her quiet presence was no longer needed. She had assumed, as she always assumed, that she was not part of whatever happened next. Rosa stared at him. I'm sorry, Luna. Rosa noticed his eyes were red. He said she's the only person who actually woke him up. Rosa looked down at Luna, who was awake now and eating a goldfish cracker from Rosa's purse. Luna, would you like to go say hello to the man from before? Luna looked up. She thought about it for 3 full seconds, a very long time for a 3-year-old. Is he still sleeping? She asked. No, baby. He woke up. Luna nodded as if this was entirely expected. Good, she said. I knew he would. She took her mother's hand and walked down the hall. When they entered the room, Edward was propped up against the pillows. He looked smaller than the man who had terrified boardrooms. He had tubes and monitors and the particular vulnerability of someone who has been humbled by something larger than themselves. When he saw Luna, his whole face changed. He looked at her the way you look at something that has saved your life, with a disbelief so deep it edges into something sacred. Hi, Luna said cheerfully. Hi, Edward said. His voice was rough and quiet. You woke up, Luna said. She seemed pleased. I did, he said. And then, thank you. Luna considered this seriously. You're welcome, she said. But you should stop sleeping on floors. It's not good for your back. Mama says so. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Edward Harrington laughed. It was small and weak and unpracticed, like someone playing an instrument they had set down long ago. But it was real. He looked up at Rosa over Luna's head. And for the first time in 2 years, 2 years of passing her in hallways, 2 years of pointing instead of speaking, 2 years of treating her like furniture, he looked her in the eye. I don't know your name, he said. Rosa, she said quietly. Rosa, he repeated, as if learning it. I'm sorry. I should have known that a long time ago. Edward Harrington spent 3 more weeks in that hospital. And in those 3 weeks, something extraordinary happened. Not in his chest, but in his character. His real father years ago suddenly found themselves sitting by his bedside having conversations they had given up on before they turned 30. Real conversations. Honest ones. Edward listened, actually listened, without checking his phone or planning his next meeting. Just sat there with his full attention, the way a father is supposed to. Fletcher, who had worked in his father's company for 4 years without receiving so much as a personal email, told his father real things one afternoon. And his father heard every word. Dad, Fletcher said near the end, what happened in there? What did you see? Edward was quiet for a while. He looked out at the gray October sky. I don't remember much, he said finally. It was dark, very quiet. I felt far away from everyone. He paused. I could hear things. Distant, muffled, like being at the bottom of a pool and hearing the world above the water. What brought you back? Fletcher asked. Edward thought for a long time. I felt something small, he said. Something simple. And it just pulled me, like a hand reaching down. He looked at his son. It sounds crazy. It doesn't, Fletcher said. The medical community, true to form, had a clinical explanation. The physical stimulation may have triggered a startle reflex, combined with the sound of a child's voice, which the brain can sometimes still process in reduced states of consciousness. Luna's actions may have provided the neurological nudge that Edward's recovering brain needed to break through. It was unusual. It was not, technically, a miracle. Or so they said. Rosa heard this explanation from the neurologist and nodded politely and said nothing. On the day Edward was discharged, he did something that made his entire staff stand completely still. He walked to the parking lot himself, slowly, holding the railing, stopping twice to catch his breath. But he walked. And when he reached the black car waiting for him, he stopped. Because Rosa was loading her bag into a cab 20 feet away, Luna on her hip, about to go home. Rosa, Edward called. Rosa turned. He walked over. He reached into his coat pocket and held out an envelope. I had Daniel prepare this, he said. It's not enough. It won't ever be enough. But I needed to start somewhere. Mr. Harrington, I didn't do anything. You stayed, he said. And the simple weight of those two words, the way he said them, not as a compliment but as a confession, made Rose's eyes fill with tears. You stayed, he said again, for 3 days. You had no reason to. I never gave you any reason to. He paused. I'm going to try to change that. Starting now. Rosa took the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, shaking but legible, and a check. Enough money to stop working entirely for a full year. To take Luna to Guatemala to meet her grandmother, who Rosa hadn't been able to visit in 4 years. To rest. To breathe. To simply be a mother for a while, without having to be everything else at the same time. Luna, completely uninterested in the grown-up conversation, had been watching a butterfly that landed near the hospital entrance. She caught it gently in her cupped hands. Then she opened her fingers and let it go. She watched it fly away. Then she looked up at Edward Harrington. You're not sad anymore, she said. Edward looked down at the 3-year-old who had reached into the dark place where he had been lost, without explanation, without understanding what she was doing, and simply pulled him back. No, he said softly. I'm not sad anymore. He bent down, carefully, to her level. Eye to eye. Thank you, he said. Luna patted his cheek with one small hand. The way children pat things they love. Unself-conscious. Uncomplicated. Pure. You're welcome, she said. Then she wriggled down, took her mother's hand, and walked toward the cab, already distracted by a pigeon near the sidewalk. Edward stood up slowly. Wilson said gently beside him. I know, Edward said. But he didn't move for another long moment. He was looking at the sky. The same gray October sky that had hung over the city for 3 days while he was somewhere between here and gone. The same cold, ordinary, unremarkable sky. But it looked, he would tell his therapist months later, when he finally started going to therapy for the first time in his life, different. It looked like something he had never bothered to look at before. It looked like enough. Sometimes, the most powerful thing in the world isn't money. It isn't degrees or titles or the number of zeros in your bank account. Sometimes, the most powerful thing in the world is a 3-year-old girl with a yellow crayon who simply refuses to believe that someone is gone. Edward spent the next 2 years quietly rebuilding, not his empire, but himself. He reached out to employees he had hurt. He called his sons on Tuesdays just to talk. He visited his mother's grave for the first time in 6 years and stayed for 3 hours. Rosa did go to Guatemala. Luna met her great-grandmother, a tiny, fierce woman of 81 who cried for 20 minutes and then immediately started feeding everyone. Rosa called it the best month of her entire life. And Luna? Luna started preschool that year. Her very first report card said, extraordinarily empathetic, deeply curious, and completely unafraid of strangers. Her mother read that and smiled for a full minute. If you are watching this today and you feel lost, if you feel like you've been somewhere dark and can't find your way back, I want you to hear this. Something is reaching for you right now, in this exact moment. Maybe it's a person you haven't met yet. Maybe it's a memory. Maybe it's something as small and ridiculous and perfect as a 3-year-old pinching your nose. But something is reaching for you. All you have to do is let your eyes flutter open. If this story touched your heart or made you cry, I promise I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.